So perhaps to Dr. Sumption, the political problem that there is in the country, I think, is that people see these boats coming over and they see these migrant hotels filling up. So do you think that the changes that are being proposed are going to affect any of that?
I don't think that the settlement changes won't necessarily affect the number of people coming in small boats. Obviously, there are specific, there's the proposal for people who've then entered the country illegally to have a much longer route to settlement, which could, in theory, have some impact. But to be honest, I wouldn't necessarily expect it to have a very big impact. Particularly, you've got some groups of people who are coming over on small boats who have already been refused asylum in Europe. They have no other options, right? They're not choosing between multiple countries. They're coming to the UK because they've already been refused elsewhere. And so if you think about people in that type of situation, a 30-year route to settlement is the only thing on the table. So I wouldn't expect there to be a big impact on small boats. Can I just add something, a technical point on the 15-year route for care workers? And this also applies to the other middle-skilled jobs where you've got a route that's been closed, and then this is just a legacy. You've got this cohort of people who are in the UK. There's a challenge. If they still have to be with a licensed sponsor, we may over time see a diminishing number of these sponsors, right? Because employers won't have an incentive anymore to become a sponsor as the number of care workers. Currently, there's still an incentive to be a sponsor because there are quite a lot of displaced workers, they're international students. Over time, then towards the end of that 15-year period, it becomes increasingly difficult for people to switch jobs because there just are not going to be as many licensed care employers. And so I think there's a technical question about whether the government wants to do anything to try and increase mobility. And the government has no reason to keep people with the same employer. That just increases exploitation, right? They may want to keep people in the care sector, but it may require some thought as to how to make sure that people can still move around between jobs.
See, I'm worried that we'll run out of care workers. We've introduced some changes which are designed to lower the incentives to come to this country, but we might actually end up with not enough people to look after us as we age. And the other thing that, following from what Margaret had to say, is that there are definitely groups of individuals coming to see me who are very worried about the change in the length of time. They're already in the system. They're nursing assistants, actually, and they were expecting to get citizenship and indefinite leave to remain at time X, and now they suddenly see that disappearing into the future, and they feel massively betrayed, actually. And these are the people who are actually the main workers in our care and hospitals. So I'm worried about that. Do you have a worry about that too?
I think that comes back to the fairness discussion. I guess it's a fairness question and then it's a reputational discussion that we've discussed.
It feels like changing the rules in the middle of the game.
And the other issue is to do with the care worker visa itself. I mean, the way the policy was designed, pushed by the Department of Health, sort of forced on the Home Office, very badly designed, no assessment of what the demand was in the market, no setting of quotas, no controls really, and very lax enforcement and oversight by the Home Office. So we've ended up with a very poorly designed policy which allowed a lot of people in, and now those people who came in because they were invited to come in by UK employers are being punished for it, and I don't think that is fair.
In a situation which, as Dr. Sumption said, isn't actually probably going to do nothing about the main political problem, which is that there are people who are desperate coming across on boats. Thank you. Yeah.
You want to add anything?
Yeah, I was just going to say on that, I'd go back to something I said earlier, that actually, although it's totally understandable that people who came in the expectation that these were going to be the rules are incredibly upset about that, whether going forward this affects our ability to recruit workers, I'm more sceptical. If you look at the overproduction of nurses in the Philippines, for example, they're just so, there's so many people who want to move to a country like the UK. Their tolerance for poor conditions, I'm afraid, is quite high.
Just because they have a tolerance for poor conditions doesn't mean to say that we should be tolerating poor conditions.
No, that's the moral issue of it. But I don't think the practical, means we're going to be unable to hire people is quite right.
Before I did this job, I was a hospital consultant. So I'm interested in what the effect of this is going to be on healthcare workers and also care workers. And I think for those of us of a certain age who've had parents perhaps that have been in care, we're all aware that many of the care workers have come from other countries. And this is true in all countries, actually. Now, what I'd like to ask, I think perhaps Alan first, is what do you think the implications are on primarily on care workers for this settlement change?
Well, I think if it's changed, there are two things that will happen. Is that they will, be sort of stuck within social care for longer than they would otherwise be. We know there have been quite serious problems with the way that some of these workers have been treated by some employers, so it's going to do that. They will also not be eligible for, welfare benefits. They're pretty low-paid workers on the whole. A Brit earning that much would, often be getting more benefits. Some care workers came in with children. Obviously that's not possible anymore, but there are children. Those children will be growing up in probably some of the poorest households in the UK. So I think that's the sort of the consequences for them. If you look on the other side, the consequences for the government, if they are given settlement, it means sort of two things. Firstly, there's this eligibility for welfare benefits. That potentially can be quite a large sum of money for the government at a time when it doesn't feel it's sort of flush, basically. And secondly, it gives them the freedom to change employers. And it's quite likely that in that situation, many care workers will choose to leave the care sector for exactly the same reason that the Brits, don't leave the care sector, namely paying conditions are not really attractive enough. And that's sort of what happens, Canada with its caregiver visa, 10 years after entering as a care worker, 10%, 15% are still working as care workers. So I think those are sort of how I would see, the trade-offs in this question of whether they should get settlement on the existing rules or go to something else. 15 years strikes me as a very long time to wait. So even if you were to lengthen it, it wouldn't necessarily have to be to 15 years.
Essentially what we'd be talking about are tied workers. Am I correct in that? So you tie a worker to a low-paid job for 15 years before they're entitled to go for settlement and citizenship, which seems to me to be an enormously long period of time, especially in a situation where we're very short of care workers. So the net migration, I think, came down from nearly 1 million to about, I believe, 200,000 or so last year. So do you have a sort of ballpark figure in your head of what the number would need to be for us to sustain our care sector? Or are we at risk of having a care sector with no workers?
My view on the care sector, the real decision that is are you going to pay these workers properly, offer competitive pay conditions, yes or no? If you say no, you're going to obviously save the government money. You're going to have to use migration. That migration, I think, is going to have to be essentially temporary migration. That's what other countries, do in that scenario. If you say we're going to pay them properly, then there are lots of people who are able to do this job. It's that they don't want to do this job given paying conditions. I don't think you need a visa then, just in the same way as we don't need visas for supermarket workers and so on and so forth. So I think what we've had, unfortunately, is something that is a bit between the two, falls between these two options, and that's sort of why find ourselves in quite a difficult situation.
Feels like we're not really going to solve a problem. That's how it feels to me.